I never noticed the church before, though I must have passed by that stretch of woods 100 times. Maybe more. It wasn't the type of place you forget. Old stone, crumbling walls, and a sagging steeple that leaned as if it had grown tired of holding up the sky. That day, the sun was beginning to set behind the trees, casting the structure in a blood-orange glow that made its appearance all the more surreal. I was late for work and had no time to stop, but I found myself slowing down, squinting at the dark windows. They were pitch black, not just in shadow but like voids swallowing any light that tried to touch them. The longer I stared, the heavier the air felt, as if the humidity had condensed into something thick, pressing against my skin. A strange sensation crept over me like the building was watching me, observing me with an unnatural awareness. I shook it off and kept driving. Just an old church, I thought, likely forgotten and overgrown. Still, the feeling lingered, a small itch at the back of my mind that I couldn't quite reach. But I had to let it go. Time was ticking, and the more I thought about it, the more absurd it seemed. That night, though, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those windows again, staring back at me, wide and unblinking. The next morning, despite having no reason to go that way, I found myself driving the same route. I wanted to see it again to prove to myself that it was just a regular, dilapidated building. Nothing more. When I arrived at the spot, the church was still there, but it felt different. The air was heavy, stagnant like the breath before a storm, and the sky seemed dimmer, even though the sun was climbing higher. The place looked even older, more decayed than I remembered from just the day before. There was something off about it, something unsettling. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Then I realized there was no sound. No birds chirping, no wind rustling the leaves, not even the distant hum of traffic. The world around the church was silent. A flicker of movement caught my eye. I leaned forward, squinting at one of the dark windows, and for the briefest moment I saw something. A shadow, maybe? It was fast, darting out of view before I could focus on it. My heart skipped a beat. Was it just my imagination, or had something truly been inside? Curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me. I pulled the car to the side of the road and stepped out, feet crunching on the gravel. The silence hit me like a wall, louder than any noise I had ever heard. I stood there, staring at the church, trying to decide if I should get closer. As I debated, a low groan echoed from inside the building. The sound was faint but unmistakable. It sent chills racing down my spine. I turned to get back in the car, but my foot caught on something. Looking down, I saw a chain, rusted, broken, stretching out from the bushes, disappearing into the tall grass near the base of the church. My pulse quickened. What the hell was a chain doing out here? I don't know what made me do it, but I tugged at the chain. It didn't move at first, tangled in the underbrush. But as I pulled harder, it began to slide free, clinking against the stones. Then, without warning, the chain snapped back, yanked out of my hands as if something on the other end had jerked it violently. I stumbled back, heart pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The chain slithered back into the bushes, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys, hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. As I started the engine and sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The church stood there, looming in the distance, unchanged. But this time something was different. In one of those black windows high up near the bell tower there was a figure. It was just standing there, motionless, watching me. I floored the gas, not daring to look back again. Later that night, I lay in bed trying to rationalize what had happened. It had to be my mind playing tricks, right? Just some weird old building, a trick of the light. But as I lay there in the dark, I heard something faint in the distance, a low metallic clink. The same sound as that rusted chain. I couldn't get the church out of my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the window, still as stone, yet somehow filled with menace. I told myself it was just a shadow, that my mind had conjured something out of the weirdness of the day, but the chain, that rusted, jerking chain, that wasn't my imagination. The next morning I decided to go back. It made no sense, I knew that. But there was this gnawing pull inside me, like something in that decaying building wanted me there. Needed me there. I couldn't explain it, but the sensation was overwhelming, like a siren call echoing in the deepest parts of my mind. It was reckless, sure. But I couldn't shake it. I had to know what was inside. The drive felt shorter this time, though the sun was just as high, casting the same eerie shadows across the trees. When I pulled up to the side of the road, the church looked no different than before, its crumbling walls and crooked steeple standing defiantly against time. But something was calmer, quieter, as though the building had been waiting for me. The air was thick again, heavy with that oppressive stillness, but this time, it felt almost inviting, like the silence was holding its breath, waiting for me to act. I stepped out of the car and approached the building, my footsteps muffled by the overgrown grass. There was no sign of the chain from yesterday. The bushes and undergrowth near the base of the church had swallowed it completely. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't. If anything, it made the place feel even more alive, as if the church itself had been hiding things from me, choosing what I could and couldn't see. I walked closer, my eyes locked on the darkened windows. I half expected to see the figure again, watching from high above, but the windows were empty this time. Hollow. For a few moments I just stood there, staring up at the structure, trying to summon the courage to take another step. My heart was hammering in my chest, each beat loud and steady in my ears. But nothing happened. No sound, no movement. Just that dead, suffocating silence. I don't know how long I stood there before I finally decided to go inside. My body moved almost on its own, a strange magnetic force pulling me closer to the door. The wood was swollen with rot, cracked and splintered, but when I pushed, it gave way with a groan, swinging inward far too easily for something that had been abandoned for decades. Inside, the air was damp and cool, thick with the scent of mold and decay. The pews, once rows of polished wood, were now broken, warped beyond recognition. Piles of debris littered the floor, and the stone walls were streaked with black stains that ran down from the ceiling like old wounds. And then there was the cross. It stood at the far end of the room, looming over everything, casting a long shadow across the floor. It was massive, much larger than I'd expected, with deep carvings that twisted and spiraled in a language I couldn't read. But it wasn't the cross itself that held my attention. It was the figure. She was standing right next to it. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes locked onto her. She was cloaked in black, her form slender and impossibly still, like she had been carved from the shadows themselves. Her face was obscured by a veil, but I could see the outline of her features, sharp, angular, with an air of something ancient and unnatural. For a moment we just stood there, staring at each other across the empty room. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How could someone else be here? How could she have appeared so suddenly? Before I could move or even think to speak, the figure shifted. Slowly, her head tilted upward, and even though her face was hidden, I felt her gaze land on me. A cold, creeping dread crawled up my spine. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows lengthening, stretching toward me as though they were alive. My legs screamed at me to run, to get out of that cursed place, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped in that terrible, frozen moment. Then she jumped. I didn't see it. 1 second she was standing by the cross, and the next she was hurtling toward me, her veil flying back to reveal her face, twisted, hollow, her eyes wide and black as bottomless pits. She wasn't human. She couldn't be. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, her teeth jagged and sharp like broken glass. She hit me like a force of nature, knocking the breath from my lungs. The world spun and I crashed to the floor with a sickening thud. Her cold fingers wrapped around my throat, squeezing tighter and tighter until I could barely draw a breath. Her face was inches from mine, her eyes boring into me, endless and full of hatred. I tried to scream, to kick, to fight, but her strength was overwhelming, unnatural. The darkness was closing in, and I could feel my body growing cold as the pressure on my neck increased. Just when I thought it was over, everything stopped. The weight on my chest vanished, the cold fingers gone. I gasped for air, choking, coughing, my throat burning as I scrambled to my feet. I looked around wildly, but the figure was gone. The room was empty, silent once again. The only sound was my ragged breathing, echoing off the stone walls. I bolted for the door, stumbling over debris as I fled. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the sunlight blinding as I burst into the open air. My legs gave out and I collapsed onto the grass, sucking in deep, desperate breaths. But something was wrong. I looked back at the church, my heart still racing. The door was wide open, but there was no sign of the figure. No sign of her at all. And no sign of me. I blinked, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. My car was still parked at the side of the road. But there was someone else standing near it, someone who looked just like me. They were staring at the church, their face a mask of confusion, their body stiff and frozen, just like I had been moments before. And then they turned, slowly, and walked back toward the car, leaving me behind. I screamed, but no sound came out. I was gone.